The Elysium station was a miracle of engineering if miracles included duct tape and a prayer. It hovered like a drunken butterfly on the edge of known space, where every rivet squeaked, and the air smelled vaguely of despair and burnt coffee. Humans called it their diplomatic crown jewel. Aliens probably had less flattering terms. Harkin Vire stood by the viewport, arms crossed, fingers drumming against his elbow. He was the kind of diplomat you'd send in when you wanted things to either go very well or very, very poorly. His suit was unwrinkled, unlike his mood. "Remember, team," he said, not bothering to turn around, "we're here to pretend we can all get along." "Pretend's the key word, boss," said Zadra, his assistant, whose aptitude for sarcasm was rivaled only by her collection of questionable tattoos. She leaned against the control panel, eyeing the flickering readouts with skepticism. "If I had a credit for every time you said something insightful," Harkin replied, "I'd have a credit. Now, let's go make some history, or at least avoid making headlines." The conference hall was a masterpiece of utilitarian ugliness, with chair cushions as welcoming as a metal slab in a morgue. Delegates from across the galaxy were crammed into the space like sardines in a tin can, if sardines could wield bureaucracy like a weapon. Harkin took his spot at the human delegation table, trying to ignore the fact that the representative from the Zogran Empire was looking at him like he was lunch, or maybe breakfast. "Welcome, esteemed colleagues," Harkin began, voice smooth as oil on a slip and slide. "Today we stand on the brink of a new era of peace." The lights flickered, then died. The hum of the station changed pitch, a sound not unlike a giant throat clearing ominously. "Who forgot to pay the power bill?" Zadra quipped from the shadows. "If this is a sign," Harkin muttered, "it's not a good one." Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing the hall in a sickly yellow glow that made everyone look like extras in a horror vid. A voice crackled over the intercom. "This is station control. We're experiencing technical difficulties. Please remain calm." "Sure," Harkin said, "because panic's only for when we want things to get interesting." A distant rumble shook the floor. Harkin exchanged a look with Zadra, whose unimpressed eyebrow told him everything he needed to know. "Let's take a little detour," he suggested. "Find out what's really going on before someone decides to blame us for ruining their tea party." Navigating the corridors of Elysium was like trying to find your way through a maze designed by someone who hated you personally. Harkin and Zadra moved quickly, weaving between diplomats and station personnel who looked about as useful as a chocolate teapot in a heat wave. "So, boss," Zadra said as they reached the central hub, "what's the over-under on this being an actual technical problem?" "About as likely as you getting through a day without sarcasm," Harkin replied. Zadra grinned. "Good. I'd hate to think this was just a random malfunction." They reached the control room where the scene was controlled chaos. Technicians were frantically tapping away at consoles, while a harried-looking officer barked orders like a captain trying to steer a sinking ship. "What's the situation?" Harkin asked, approaching the officer. "Structural failures across the station," the officer said, his face a mask of stress. "It's like someone's shaking us like a maraca. Any idea who's playing the music?" "Not yet, but my money's on someone who really hates peace talks." The station shuddered again, a metal groan echoing through the corridors. It was the kind of sound that made you think of failing airlocks and explosive decompression. "We need to get eyes on this," Harkin said. "See what's happening outside." Zadra nodded, already moving to a console displaying external feeds. She tapped a few keys, bringing up a view of the station's exterior. What they saw made Harkin's stomach drop. Ships, a lot of them, hanging in space like sharks circling an injured prey. "Looks like we've got company," Zadra said, her tone too casual to be comforting. "The kind that brings flowers or the kind that brings death rays?" Harkin asked. "Let's go with Plan B." Zadra magnified the feed, revealing the ship's markings unknown but unmistakably aggressive. "This feels like a setup," Harkin muttered. "Someone wants us rattled and they've brought friends." The intercom crackled again. "All stations prepare for incoming vessels. Engage defensive protocols." Like that'll help, Zadra remarked. I'd bet our defenses are as reliable as a politician's promise. We've got to warn the delegates, Harkin said, already turning back toward the conference hall. And then what? Ask nicely for the bad guys to leave us alone. Something like that, Harkin replied, knowing full well their chances were as slim as a diet cola. As they raced back, the gravity of the situation weighed heavy, but Harkin couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to turn this disaster around. Humans had a knack for pulling victory out of the jaws of defeat, or at least making the jaws choke on them. They burst into the conference hall, the delegates in various states of clueless panic. Everyone, Harkin called out, raising his voice over the rising din, we're facing an imminent threat. We need to coordinate, not panic. The Zogran representative sneered. Typical human overconfidence. Overconfidence? No, Harkin shot back. Just the right amount of stubbornness. Now if we can stop bickering, maybe we can figure out how to not die today. I like living, Zadra interjected with a grin. Dying's just so permanent. See, even my assistant gets it. The rumble returned, more pronounced, more menacing. It felt like the universe itself was mocking their attempts at diplomacy. We need a plan, Harkin said. Something that involves not getting blown up. A novel idea, Zadra quipped. Shame we didn't think of it sooner. But they didn't have sooner. They barely had now. And as Harkin scanned the room, he realized that whatever they did next, it'd have to be quick, decisive, and probably incredibly stupid. Everyone, Harkin ordered, buckle up. We're about to make history. The station's alarms blared, a discordant symphony of chaos, and Harkin couldn't help but smirk. It was just another day at the office. The station's systems had decided to join the party, flickering and failing like a malfunctioning disco ball. Harkin had seen more stability on a roller coaster held together with chewing gum. The emergency sirens wailed, a sound that perfectly captured the mood of a group of diplomats realizing they might have to actually work together to avoid dying. Well, isn't this fun? Zadra remarked, dodging a hysterical delegate who seemed to think that running in circles was a viable survival tactic. I always wanted to see how a peace conference turns into a disaster movie. Harkin scanned the chaos, his diplomatic instincts kicking in. He had a nose for trouble, and right now, that nose was practically on fire. Keep your head on a swivel, Zadra. I smell sabotage, and it reeks worse than the station's cafeteria on curry night. Count me out of the detective work, she replied, tapping on her wrist console. I'm more of a shoot first, roll eyes later kind of girl. As if on cue, the station shuddered again, this time with the unsettling grace of a drunk trying to navigate a revolving door. The lights flickered, fittingly as if to say, we've given up too. The intercom, crackling with static, announced another gem of encouragement. Attention, structural integrity compromised. Please proceed to the nearest escape pod. Harkin arched an eyebrow. Sure, because we all know the pods are in pristine condition, just like the rest of this station. Zadra rolled her eyes. I'd rather take my chances with a toaster strapped to a firecracker. Harkin turned his attention back to the delegates. All right, people, time to earn those cushy salaries. We need some semblance of order if we're not going to end up as space debris. A delegate from the Jorlan Confederacy raised a hand, his expression a cocktail of pomposity and panic. What's the plan, human? Plan, Harkin said, flashing a grin sharper than a politician's promise. We improvise, like usual. As if to punctuate his statement, a console beside them erupted in a shower of sparks, sending one diplomat diving for cover. Zadra looked unimpressed, as if she'd seen better effects in a low-budget holo flick. Now let's focus on the immediate problem, Harkin continued, rallying what little attention he could get. We've got ships outside with questionable intentions. Anyone have a direct line to the cavalry? The delegates exchanged glances like schoolchildren caught without their homework. Silence stretched, awkward and heavy. Fantastic, Harkin sighed. Looks like we're all in this alone. Just the way I like it. Zadra nudged him, directing his gaze to a display that had miraculously survived. It showed a countdown, not the good kind that ends with confetti and cake, but the kind that ends with a bang. "Timer's ticking, boss," she said. "Any chance we can rewrite this script?" Harkin rubbed his temples. "First, we figure out who's shaking the station. Then we convince them it's in their best interest to stop before we all end up in orbit around oblivion." Just as he said it, the control room's door hissed open, revealing an engineer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. His name tag read Moxley, and he carried the air of someone who'd just been told his vacation was canceled. "Moxley," Harkin said, waving the engineer over. "What's the status? And please lie to me. I'd love to hear some good news for a change." Moxley gulped, sweat beading on his brow. "Bad news, I'm afraid. The systems are failing faster than we can patch them. Looks like an external attack. Something's manipulating our controls." "Wonderful," Zadra muttered. "We're being hacked by a bunch of galactic trolls. What next? A ransom demand for our dignity." Harkin considered the implications. "Hacked, you say? Any chance we can trace the source?" Moxley shook his head. "They're good, whoever they are. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack when the haystack's on fire." "Ever considered a career in motivational speaking, Moxley?" Harkin quipped. "Keep this up and you might just have us all singing Kumbaya." Another delegate, this time from the Ferox Coalition, piped up. "Surely the humans have contingency plans for such scenarios." "Of course," Harkin said, maintaining a veneer of optimism. "It's called don't panic while we make it up as we go." "Seriously, though," Zadra interrupted, "if we're going to avoid turning into cosmic dust, we need to get proactive." "Agreed," Harkin replied. "Let's start by figuring out who benefits from a bunch of diplomats floating off into the void." The station groaned again, a reminder that time wasn't on their side. Harkin racked his brain, the pieces of this grim puzzle refusing to fit together. It felt orchestrated, a symphony of chaos with someone else holding the baton. "Zadra, round up whoever's left in charge of security and get them to secure the delegates. Last thing we need is for someone to start a brawl over the last seat in the escape pod." "You got it," Zadra replied, already turning away. "I'll see if anyone's left with half a brain." The control room was alive with tension, the air thick with apprehension and the occasional whiff of burnt electronics. Harkin watched as Moxley scrambled to keep the station from imploding, his fingers dancing over controls like a desperate conductor trying to salvage a doomed performance. "Anything else we can do?" Harkin asked, leaning over Moxley's console. "Not unless you can magically stabilize a crumbling station," Moxley replied. "We're on borrowed time and the interest rate's through the roof." "Still, there's got to be something," Harkin pressed. "A backdoor, a failsafe, anything." Moxley hesitated, glancing around as if the walls might sprout ears. "There might be one thing," he said, his voice low. "But it's risky. We could try resetting the mainframe, but it'd leave us blind for a few minutes." "And in those few minutes," Harkin asked, "we either stabilize or we become a very expensive firework in space." Harkin considered his options, which were about as plentiful as honesty in politics. "Do it. We'll take our chances." Moxley nodded, his hands moving with renewed urgency. Harkin turned to the room, raising his voice to cut through the din. "Listen up. We're attempting a reset. It's going to get dark for a bit, so hold on to something and try not to scream too loud." Zadra returned, accompanied by a handful of beleaguered security personnel. "Got the best of the worst," she said. "They look ready to handle anything as long as it doesn't involve actually doing something." "Better than nothing," Harkin replied. "Get them to the conference hall, keep everyone calm. Or as calm as possible under the circumstances." "On it," Zadra said, giving him a mock salute before herding the security forces out like a reluctant shepherd with a particularly stubborn flock. As Moxley initiated the reset sequence, the lights dimmed, casting the room into a murky twilight. Harkin's heart thudded in his chest, each beat echoing the station's precarious state. He felt the weight of countless lives pressing down, a burden he wore like a second skin. The seconds stretched, elastic and unyielding. The station seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if this gamble would pay off or sink them all into oblivion. Then, with a hum of returning power, the systems flickered back to life. Harkin exhaled, a smile breaking across his face. "Well, look at that. We're not dead yet." Moxley released a shaky laugh, wiping sweat from his brow. "That was something. We've got some systems back online, but the threat's still out there." Harkin nodded, a sense of determination settling over him like a battle-worn cloak. "Then let's find out who's pulling our strings. I'm tired of dancing to someone else's tune." Zadra returned, her expression reflecting a rare moment of seriousness. "The delegates are secure for now, but we're still sitting ducks." "Not for long," Harkin promised. "We're going to turn this around, somehow." The station continued its slow dance of survival, a testament to human ingenuity or stubbornness. Harkin didn't care which. All he knew was that there was a fight ahead, and he wasn't about to let some shadowy puppet master have the last laugh. As he and Zadra left the control room, Harkin couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking their every move. It was a feeling he intended to return with interest. "Let's go, Zadra," he said, his voice brimming with resolve. Time to bring the fight to them. And with that, they plunged back into the chaos of Elysium Station, ready to face whatever came next with sarcasm, grit, and just a touch of reckless defiance. The lights dimmed again, flickering as if Elysium Station was trying to decide between staying functional or just giving up on life altogether. Harkin and Zadra navigated the cluttered corridors, which were as crammed with panicked delegates as a sardine can at rush hour. The air was filled with the scent of sweat and fear, with a hint of burnt circuitry, just enough to remind them of the station's murder-suicide packed with entropy. "Think the lights are practicing for a disco revival, or is the station just screwing with us?" Zadra asked, her voice a blend of dry wit and mild exasperation. "I'd put my money on bitter resentment," Harkin replied, sidestepping a distraught delegate who was muttering something about the futility of existence. "This place hasn't seen a maintenance team since the last ice age. At least it's reliable in its unreliability," Zadra quipped. "What's the plan now, boss? We're one step away from using carrier pigeons." "We go old school," Harkin said. "We're talking Stone Age communication. Something these alien hackers won't expect." He led them to a storage room, an oversized closet filled with dusty tech relics that looked like they belonged in a museum. Harkin rifled through the detritus of outdated gadgets, finally unearthing an ancient hand-cranked radio. It was a clunky, ugly thing, but it didn't need a network connection to send messages. Zadra raised an eyebrow. "A radio? Seriously?" "What are we, pirates?" "In a way," Harkin said, cranking the handle with a smile that was all teeth. "Looks like we're about to reinvent ourselves as space-age buccaneers. Besides, who knows the magic of analog better than a bunch of aliens dependent on digital? They won't see this coming." Zadra leaned against a crate, arms crossed. "And next you'll tell me we're sending smoke signals through the ventilation." "Now there's an idea," Harkin mused. "But first, let's see if we can get this relic to send our SOS to any ships in range." As Harkin fiddled with the dials, the station made another groan, like an old man complaining about the weather. A clunky whirring followed, and the radio crackled to life. Static filled the room, a symphony of hisses and pops. "Easy as pie," Harkin muttered, adjusting the frequency. If pie was made of rust and bad decisions. They eventually found a clear channel, well as clear as anything could be on a dying space station. Harkin leaned in, his voice steady despite the chaos. "This is Elysium Station. We are under attack, systems compromised. Request immediate assistance." "Repeat, immediate assistance needed." He released the button, the static swallowing his plea. Harkin and Zadra exchanged a look, both acknowledging the futility of the situation with a shared smirk. "Think anyone's listening?" Zadra asked, eyeing the radio like it might sprout legs and run off. "Let's hope so," Harkin replied. "Otherwise, we're just talking to ghosts." As they left the storage room, an eerie sensation crept over them, like the feeling you get when you know you're being stared at, but can't see by whom. It was the unmistakable crawl of paranoia, and they weren't the only ones feeling it. Rumors were spreading faster than the malfunctioning lights. Delegates huddled in corners, their conversations hushed and tinged with suspicion. Whispers of alien mind control, sabotage, and betrayal hung in the air like a fog nobody wanted to admit was there. Zadra nudged Harkin, nodding towards a haggard-looking diplomat from the Zintari delegation. He was staring into space, mumbling incoherently, his eyes wide and unseeing. "Think he's finally snapped?" Zadra asked. "Either that or he's having a moment of clarity," Harkin replied. Both equally terrifying. They approached the diplomat, who snapped out of his trance with the urgency of someone waking from a nightmare. "They're in our heads," he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. Harkin raised an eyebrow. "Who's they, and can they fix the power while they're at it?" The diplomat glanced around nervously, as if expecting to be silenced by some unseen force. "The aliens, they're whispering, making us doubt. I can feel them like an itch you can't scratch." Harkin exchanged a knowing look with Zadra. This was new, and not the good kind of new like finding a 20-credit note in your pocket. "We need to keep this under wraps," Harkin said quietly. "Last thing we need is a panic on top of a panic." "Should we tell Moxley?" Zadra asked, her voice laced with skepticism. "Better not," Harkin replied. "He might just hijack the next escape pod and leave us to deal with this cosmic cluster ourselves." As they moved on, the station's atmosphere grew heavier, as if the very air knew something sinister was afoot. The whispers spread, insidious and silent, wrapping around the delegates' minds like a cold vine. It wasn't long before the paranoia began to manifest. Arguments erupted over nothing, each accusation more absurd than the last. Zadra watched a scuffle break out over a pack of ration bars, the combatants grappling like rabid badgers. Harkin sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Looks like the peace conference just declared war on itself." Who knew diplomacy could be so undiplomatic? Zadra quipped, watching as a few more security personnel intervened, breaking up the fight with less enthusiasm than a sloth on sedatives. "Let's see if we can calm things down," Harkin suggested, though he sounded about as hopeful as a condemned man on the gallows. They waded into the chaos, Harkin raising his voice to be heard over the din. "Everyone, calm down. Fighting among ourselves just makes us easier targets." "Easy for you to say," someone shouted back, a hint of hysteria in their voice. "We're being attacked and you're telling us to keep calm." Zadra stepped in, her tone sharp enough to cut through the noise. "We have bigger problems than who gets the last stale muffin. Let's not make it worse by losing our heads." The room quieted, if only for a moment. The delegates' eyes, darting suspiciously, settled into a tense silence. Harkin seized the opportunity. "We need to work together. Whoever's behind this wants us divided, and we're not going to give them that satisfaction." It was a nice speech, but he knew it wouldn't hold for long. The paranoia was like a virus, seeping into every corner of the station, infecting thoughts and actions with a creeping dread. Zadra leaned closer. "We have to find these whispers and shut them up before this turns into a full-scale riot." "Agreed," Harkin replied. "But first we need to find out how they're getting into our heads." They left the conference hall, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on them. The corridors were quieter now, as if the station itself was listening. "Feels like we're fighting shadows," Zadra said, her voice low. "How do you hit something you can't see?" "With the element of surprise," Harkin suggested. "But first, we need to find a way to see them." Their search for answers led them to the station's less glamorous areas, the forgotten nooks and crannies where only dust and neglect dared to tread. It was in one such place they found a clue, an unassuming maintenance panel slightly ajar, wires spilling out like the guts of a slaughtered beast. "Looks like someone's been here," Harkin noted, inspecting the mess. "And not just to tidy up." Zadra crouched beside the panel, her eyes narrowing. "You think this is where they're hiding?" "Could be," Harkin said. "Or it could be nothing. But in our situation, I'm willing to bet on anything." They followed the trail of wires, a makeshift breadcrumb path leading them deeper into the station's bowels. It was here they stumbled upon a small device, pulsing with an eerie glow. It was nestled among the cables like a poisonous egg, whispering its insidious message into the station's heart. "Found our whispering menace," Harkin said, his voice a mix of triumph and dread. Zadra regarded the device with disdain. "Should we smash it, or do you want to take it home as a souvenir?" "Tempting as that is, let's not," Harkin replied. "We need to study it, figure out how it works, and then shut it down." He gingerly extracted the device, careful not to damage it further. It was deceptively simple in design, yet sophisticated enough to bypass the station's defenses without raising alarms. As they made their way back, Harkin couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching them, unseen, unblinking, waiting for them to make a mistake. Zadra must have felt it too. "Feels like we're walking a tightrope here," she said. "One wrong step and we're space toast," Harkin finished. "But if we play this right, we might just turn the tables." Back at the makeshift command center, Moxley's eyes widened at the sight of the device. "Where did you find that?" "In the depths of despair," Harkin replied, handing it over. "Think you can crack it?" Moxley examined it, his expression a mix of curiosity and dread. "I'll see what I can do, but no promises." "That's the spirit," Zadra said. "If nothing else, it'll keep your mind off the apocalypse." While Moxley worked, Harkin and Zadra kept a watchful eye over the station. The whispers seemed to retreat, but their presence lingered, a reminder that they were never truly alone. "Think we'll get out of this one?" Zadra asked, her tone light despite the gravity of the situation. "Always the optimist," Harkin replied. "But yeah, we've faced worse odds, like curry night in the cafeteria," she teased. "Exactly," Harkin said, chuckling. "If we can survive that, we can survive anything." They stood together in silence, two figures against the backdrop of a station on the brink. There was much to do, and the road ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. But as long as they had each other and a healthy dose of sarcasm, they'd keep fighting. Because that's what humans did best. When the universe threw them into chaos, they adapted, they survived, and they did it with style. As Moxley continued his work, the room settled into a tense calm. The station shuddered again, but this time it felt more like a rallying cry than a death knell. Together they braced for whatever came next, and whatever it was, they'd meet it head-on, sarcasm and grit leading the charge. Because if there was one thing Harkin Vire knew for certain, it was that the universe might be vast and uncaring, but humans were the biggest wild cards in the deck, unpredictable, irreverent, and just crazy enough to pull off a miracle now and then. The conference hall on Elysium Station was a disaster zone of epic, if not predictable, proportions. Delegates were at each other's throats, figuratively for the moment, though Harkin wouldn't place any bets on that lasting. The air was thick with paranoia, and not the juicy kind that led to exciting espionage tales, but rather the itchy, uncomfortable sort that made everyone twitchy and prone to violent outbursts. Harkin Vire stood at the edge of the chaos, cautiously sipping what passed for coffee here, more likely a blend of despair and recycled water. Zadra was next to him, her expression caught somewhere between amusement and exasperation, like a teacher witnessing the world's worst field trip. "So," Zadra began, "which one of these esteemed diplomats do you think will try to crown themselves first?" Harkin smirked, his eyes scanning the room. "I'd say Gorth from the Pindari delegation has a good shot. He's been eyeing that emergency pipe like it's Excalibur, and he calls himself a diplomat," Zadra sighed, shaking her head. "I suppose we should be grateful it's not a toaster." The noise in the room spiked as someone accused someone else of stealing their lucky atmospheric analyzer. It was shaping up to be another thrilling day of intergalactic politics. Zadra nudged Harkin, nodding toward a group forming around a particularly animated delegate, arms flailing like windmills on amphetamines. "Looks like we have a contender for most likely to incite a cult." "Ah, the crazy eyes," Harkin noted. "Always a dead giveaway." The delegate, a wiry fellow with a voice that could sandpaper paint off walls, was going on about divine messages and cosmic salvation. It was the sort of rhetoric that made Harkin's skin crawl, mostly because it was starting to sound convincing to those around him. Harkin leaned in closer to Zadra. I need to know if there's anything else behind this madness, something other than the usual amount of lunacy. Exactly. I want to know if our whispering friends are pulling more strings than we thought. As if on cue, Moxley hustled over, nearly tripping over his own feet. He was clutching the device they'd found, eyes wide with the intriguing mix of panic and discovery. "Harkin, Zadra," he panted, holding out the device. "You were right. This thing isn't just broadcasting whispers. It's hacking into our most primal fears, drawing on ancient human myths." Zadra's eyebrows shot up. "So the aliens are turning us into believers or lunatics?" Harkin deadpanned. "My money's on lunatics. They're using our stories, our history. Whatever these myths are, they're being twisted to make us see them as gods." Moxley nodded, looking as though he'd seen a ghost. "This is tech beyond anything we've encountered, a psychological weapon aimed straight at our minds. Hell of a way to make friends," Zadra observed. "And here I thought they'd just invite us out for coffee." Harkin took the device, weighing it in his hand. "So they're playing puppet master with our brains. We need to get ahead of this, stop them from turning us into a congregation of space-worshipping zealots. Any bright ideas?" Zadra asked, her tone dry as ever. "First, we quarantine the infected," Harkin decided. "Figure out who's hearing what and isolate them before it spreads." "And how do you propose we do that?" Moxley asked. "Run around asking if they've found religion, pretty much," Harkin shrugged. "Though I was thinking we could start with those who have the telltale crazy eyes." Zadra snorted. "Great. We'll just blend in with the rest of the circus." They moved through the room, weaving between clusters of delegates, their minds as much a battlefield as the station itself. Each person they approached was an unknown quantity, a potential fanatic ready to light the fuse. Harkin paused by a delegate staring into the distance, whispering about divine retribution. "See what I mean?" he muttered to Zadra. "They're lining up to drink the Kool-Aid." Zadra shook her head. "I knew space diplomacy would be interesting, but I didn't sign up for a front row seat to the apocalypse." "Perks of the job," Harkin replied. "Now let's find out just how deep this rabbit hole goes." They questioned delegates, sifting through layers of paranoia and fear, trying to discern genuine threats from garden-variety craziness. It was a task of Herculean frustration, testing their patience and their ability to keep a straight face. In the background, Moxley worked tirelessly, trying to reverse-engineer the device. His progress was slow, but every breakthrough was a small victory, a step closer to shutting down the alien influence. Harkin found himself in front of a particularly fervent delegate, a woman with wild eyes and a voice like rusty nails. She spoke of visions and celestial voices, painting a picture of salvation that was equal parts awe-inspiring and terrifying. "What are they telling you?" Harkin asked, his tone gentle but firm. Her response was a jumble of prophecy and desperation, a blend that made Harkin's skin crawl. But hidden within the madness, he caught threads of something else, something calculated. "They're using you," he said softly, trying to reach through the fog. "Manipulating you, they're gods," she insisted, her eyes shining with fervor. "They've chosen us, right?" Harkin muttered, stepping back. "Another one for the quarantine." He and Zadra corralled the afflicted into a side room, a makeshift containment area where they could be monitored. It was a messy, thankless task, but necessary if they were to maintain any semblance of control. "Think there's any hope for them?" Zadra asked as they closed the door. "There's always hope," Harkin replied. "Just not as much as they'd like." The station shuddered again, a reminder of the precarious situation they were in, as if they needed further proof that whoever had designed this place had a sick sense of humor. Moxley approached, looking as exhausted as they felt. "I've managed to disrupt part of the signal," he reported. "It's not perfect, but it might buy us some time." "Good work," Harkin said, clapping him on the back. "Now we just need to figure out the endgame. Why go to all this trouble?" Zadra mused. What's their grand plan? Harkin thought for a moment, the pieces of the puzzle floating just out of reach. Maybe they want to make us their followers, their army, or maybe it's just a game to them. Test our limits, see how far we can be pushed, or maybe, Zadra added, they just want to watch us squirm. Could be all of the above, Harkin admitted. But whatever it is, we need to stop it. The room was quiet, the silence a stark contrast to the chaos outside. They were tired, their nerves frayed, but they couldn't afford to stop fighting. Not now, when they were so close to unraveling the mystery. Let's get to work, Harkin said, his voice carrying the weight of determination. We'll figure this out the same way we get through everything else, one sarcastic comment at a time. Zadra smiled, a flicker of warmth in the gloom. Lead the way, fearless leader. Together they returned to the fray, their resolve as strong as ever. The aliens might have had the upper hand, but Harkin and his crew were nothing if not tenacious. As they moved forward, they knew the road ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty. But they would face it with humor and grit, ready to meet whatever challenges lay in wait. Because if the universe had taught them anything, it was that humans were stubborn bastards, always ready to take on the impossible with a grin and a middle finger raised to the cosmos. And that was one truth no alien whisper could silence. Harkin Vire stood there, staring at the flickering lights of Elysium Station like a man who'd just been told that his life insurance policy didn't cover imploding space stations. The chaos in the conference hall had reached a crescendo, the delegates' paranoia bubbling over into a fine froth of hysteria. And because the universe has a twisted sense of drama, the station chose this moment to shudder ominously, as if trying to shake off the burden of its malfunctioning systems. Well, this just keeps getting better, Harkin muttered, taking a sip of his coffee substitute, an insult to taste buds galaxy-wide. Zadra, standing beside him, managed a smile that could have cut glass. I'm starting to think we missed our calling as disaster tourists. Moxley, looking like a man who just discovered the meaning of life only to have it snatched away, approached them with a sense of urgency that was both irritating and contagious. We've got a problem, he said, unnecessarily, given that their predicament was the poster child for understatement of the year. What is it now? Harkin asked, bracing for the bad news buffet. The station's power grid is on the brink of collapse, Moxley replied, waving his wrist console like a magic wand that only conjured despair. If we don't fix it, we're all going to be floating in the void, and I doubt the vacuum's got a good sense of humor. Wait, you mean this floating junk heap might actually stop floating? Zadra asked, feigning shock like an actress auditioning for the role of sarcasm queen of the galaxy. The only thing holding this place together is sheer bloody-mindedness, Harkin said, scanning the room, his gaze settling on Gorth, who was now engaged in an intense and possibly romantic dialogue with. And maybe a bit of duct tape, Moxley shrugged. Hey, duct tapes held marriages together for less. The three of them shared a grim laugh, the kind that tasted more bitter than sweet, as the station groaned like an old warhorse on its last campaign. Harkin knew that their options were dwindling faster than a politician's promises post-election. All right, Harkin said, setting his mug down with the resigned air of a man ready to wade into another quagmire. We need to fix the power before we're all sucked into the great cosmic abyss. Got any bright ideas? Zadra asked, looking around at the panicked delegates whose trust in their own reality was unraveling like cheap yarn. Other than praying to the gods of faulty engineering, Harkin quipped. Not yet. The lights flickered again, casting the hall into a brief, eerie twilight that made everyone seem more like ghosts than diplomats. Harkin felt a shiver run down his spine, and it wasn't just from the chill leaking in from the failing environmental controls. As if summoned by the universe's penchant for dramatic timing, a new figure appeared among the chaos. A tall, shadowy alien with features that suggested a close relationship with nightmares. Zynral, an alien defector from the very species pulling the strings, stepped forward with the grace of a predator and the disposition of a particularly jaded cat. Zynrel Harkin greeted, not bothering to hide his surprise or his skepticism. To what do we owe the pleasure? The alien's smile was all teeth and no warmth. I bring news, human, and perhaps a chance at salvation. Salvation, huh? Got a coupon for that. Zadra quipped, crossing her arms. Zynrel ignored her, focusing instead on Harkin. Your people have something our kind fears, and what's that? A penchant for bad decisions, Harkin asked, arching an eyebrow. Imagination, Zynrel replied, as if that one word explained the universe's mysteries. Your creativity is unpredictable, uncontrollable. It terrifies us. Harkin exchanged a look with Zadra and Moxley, the kind of look shared by those standing on the precipice of a revelation or a panic attack. Why help us? Harkin asked, suspicion coloring his tone. Zynrel's expression softened just a fraction. Because I have seen what your people can do when pushed to the brink, and I'd rather be on the side that survives. Well, that's comforting, Zadra said dryly. We've got a hopeful pessimist in our corner. Harkin weighed the alien's words, considering the implications. Imagination, a weapon they hadn't realized they possessed. It was a slim chance, but a chance nonetheless. All right then, Harkin said, straightening his shoulders. Let's see how far a little human ingenuity can take us. The plan, if it could be called that, was deceptively simple. Harness the power of human creativity to disrupt the alien influence. And they'd have to do it before the station tore itself apart like a toddler with a new toy. They started with the delegates, trying to channel their fear and paranoia into something constructive, a task that made herding cats look like a well-oiled machine. Harkin had never felt more like a kindergarten teacher, albeit one tasked with corralling a room full of potentially homicidal toddlers. All right, folks, Harkin called out, raising his voice above the din. If we're going to make it out of this mess, we need to think outside the box. Or, the containment field. Moxley, ever the optimist, added, consider it a creative challenge. Like that time we got locked in the supply closet with only a spork and a can of rocket fuel. The delegates stared at them, a sea of glazed expressions and twitching nerves. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, a spark of hope began to catch, tiny, fragile, but there. Zynrel watched them with an inscrutable expression, as if trying to comprehend this strange species and their propensity for defying the odds in the most bizarre ways possible. The station groaned again, a visceral reminder that time was running out. They needed to move fast, think faster, and hope that their collective insanity would somehow translate into a miracle. Here's the plan, Harkin said, sketching out a rough diagram on his wrist console. We're going to create a feedback loop, use our imagination as a weapon to short-circuit their signals, like playing a really bad song on repeat, Zadra suggested. If it works, I'll buy you all around at the worst bar in the galaxy, Harkin promised, though he doubted they'd ever see payday. Moxley nodded, already working to modify the alien device. It's risky, but it might just work. Risky's kind of our thing, Harkin replied, glancing around at the ragtag group of diplomats who were slowly starting to look more like survivors and less like victims. Zynrel moved closer, examining the device with an intensity that suggested he was either deeply invested in their success or planning to eat the thing. Humans, he murmured, his voice a blend of curiosity and something like admiration. Always unpredictable, that's us, Harkin said with a grin. Just a bunch of unpredictable bastards. They worked quickly, setting up the feedback loop that would, hopefully, disrupt the alien influence long enough for them to stabilize the station. It was a gamble, but one they were willing to take if it meant even the slightest chance of survival. As Moxley made the final adjustments, Harkin felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe it was the knowledge that, win or lose, they'd gone down swinging. Ready? Zadra asked, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Harkin nodded, meeting her gaze with a confidence he didn't quite feel. Let's do this. Moxley activated the device, the hum of energy filling the air like an eerie lullaby. For a moment the station seemed to hold its breath, the lights flickering as if caught between worlds. And then slowly the chaos began to abate. The delegates, once frenetic and frantic, started to calm, their expressions shifting from panic to something akin to clarity. It was working, at least for now. "Looks like we bought ourselves some time," Harkin said, relief seeping into his words. Zynril nodded, a hint of approval in his gaze. "Impressive, human," the station shuddered again, a reminder that the battle wasn't over yet. But for the first time, Harkin felt a flicker of hope, a slender thread to cling to in the face of the abyss. "All right, folks," Harkin called out, addressing the delegates. "We've taken back control, but we need to keep it. Let's not squander this chance." Zadra gave him a sidelong glance, a smirk playing at her lips. "Think we can pull it off?" Harkin shrugged, the weight of their predicament still heavy on his shoulders. "If we don't, we've got a hell of a story for the afterlife." Together, they moved forward, fueled by a stubborn refusal to give up, a shared determination to defy the odds and face whatever came next with a defiant grin. Because that's what humans did. They survived, they adapted, and they never backed down from a fight, even when the universe itself seemed hell-bent on their destruction. The conference hall on Elysium Station was a symphony of chaos, if you considered a dying cat strangling a blender as a symphony. The air, thick with the kind of tension that could snap a credit chit in half, was punctuated by the frantic chatter of diplomats who were rapidly oscillating between existential dread and irrational hope. Harkin Vire surveyed the scene, the corners of his mouth twitching into something that might have been a smile on a better day. "Well, folks, we're either about to make history or become a cautionary tale for future generations," he announced, trying to channel the spirit of a motivational speaker who'd already lost his audience. Zadra snorted, her sharp smile cutting through the gloom like a knife through butter, if butter was actually made of diplomatic ineptitude. "Nothing like a good old-fashioned panic to bring people together, right?" Moxley leaned closer to Harkin, his voice barely rising above the din. "If this place falls apart, we're going to have to find a new line of work. Maybe start a band." "I hear the universe loves a tragedy." "Wouldn't be the worst idea I've heard today," Harkin replied, glancing around at the delegates who were now huddled in small groups, whispering as if planning a surprise birthday party rather than a desperate bid for survival. Zynril, the alien defector whose idea of a friendly expression looked like he was about to murder you or marry you, possibly both, stood off to the side, observing the proceedings with unnerving calm. "Human resilience is fascinating," he remarked, his words coated in the silky veneer of someone who'd never had to endure human bureaucracy. "Yeah, we're like cockroaches," Zadra quipped, crossing her arms. "Annoying, hard to kill, and somehow always hanging around where we're not wanted. Your myths are your strength," Zynril continued, ignoring the low-grade sarcasm buzzing around him. "They can be used as a weapon against the alien mind." Harkin raised an eyebrow, his skepticism wrapping around him like an old, comfortable coat. "Myths, huh? So what, we just tell ghost stories until the aliens run screaming?" "It's not about the stories themselves," Zynril explained, ever patient, like a teacher with a particularly slow student. "It's the unpredictability they inspire. The creativity." "Well," Harkin said, turning to the delegates, "time to see if bedtime stories can save our skins." The delegates looked at him, expressions ranging from disbelief to hopeful incredulity, essentially a spectrum of what the hell, let's give it a shot. They began tossing out ideas, a cacophony of half-formed plans and wishes that sounded just ridiculous enough to work. "We could pretend we're developing a new superweapon," one delegate suggested, looking way too eager for someone who just realized they might be partially responsible for saving the galaxy. "Or make them think we have the power to destroy their fleet with a thought," another chimed in, eyes wide with manic energy. As the brainstorming continued, Harkin couldn't help but feel a strange sort of pride bubbling up, like watching a group of kittens attempt to conquer the world, armed with nothing but fluff and meows. It was crazy, It was desperate, and it was entirely human. But the station wasn't about to let them relax into their insanity. The lights flickered again, this time almost long enough to think they'd given up entirely before grudgingly returning. The structure groaned ominously, a sound that could only be described as dying whale meets industrial fan. "We're running out of time," Moxley reminded them, his expression a mix of urgency, "and that I've just remembered I left the stove on panic." "Then we'd better work fast," Harkin said, rubbing the back of his neck and trying to ignore the steadily increasing tempo of his heartbeat. "Let's scare the aliens using the one thing humans excel at, making stuff up." With renewed purpose, the delegates dove into the task of crafting a narrative, a tale of human ingenuity so terrifying it would make even the most hardened alien think twice about invading Earth. Harkin watched, occasionally adding a suggestion or vetoing an idea that was just a bit too outlandish even for this crowd. Zynril remained nearby, his interest keen as he observed the frenetic energy. "Your myths are indeed strange," he noted, his head tilted slightly to one side. "But there is power in them." "That's the spirit," Zadra said, clapping him on the shoulder with enough force to send a lesser being sprawling. "Humans storytelling our way out of the apocalypse since, well, always." The station groaned again, this time accompanied by the unsettling sound of something important clattering to the floor in another room. Harkin winced, hoping it wasn't anything mission-critical, though considering the station's current state, that list was distressingly long. "Moxley, what's the status on the—" "Everything?" Harkin asked, gesturing vaguely at the mess of wires and blinking lights that constituted their makeshift control center. "Stable, for now," Moxley said, though his tone suggested he was about as confident as a cat walking a tightrope. "But we need to keep the pressure on, or this place will turn into a very expensive shooting star." "Right then," Harkin said, clapping his hands together in a gesture of finality. "Let's give the aliens a fear they'll never forget." The plan, if you could call it that, was to broadcast their fabricated mythos directly into the alien network. The hope was that the stories, steeped in human unpredictability, would cause enough confusion to give the delegates leverage, or at least buy them time to fix the station's rapidly degrading systems. As the setup continued, Harkin couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of it all. Here they were, on the brink of annihilation, rallying behind tall tales and half-truths. It was the kind of gamble that would have made even the most reckless of gamblers pause, and yet it felt right. "Once we're ready," Harkin said, addressing the room, "we'll send out the signal, our message to the universe: never underestimate human creativity. And our ability to BS our way through anything," Zadra added, earning a few chuckles from the stressed but determined crowd. Zynril, watching the chaos with a mixture of amusement and awe, nodded approvingly. "Consider me impressed, humans. Your capacity for adaptation is enlightening." "Glad to know we can still surprise," Harkin replied, his voice laced with a dry humor that masked his anxiety. The station's lights flickered again, dimming as if to emphasize the urgency of their task. Moxley muttered curses in several languages, his fingers flying over the console as he worked to stabilize their precarious situation. "Almost ready," Moxley announced, his tone suggesting that almost was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Harkin nodded, his mind racing through contingencies and worst-case scenarios. He had no illusions about their chances. This was a Hail Mary, a last-ditch effort to turn the tide against overwhelming odds. But then again, wasn't that the human way? To fight tooth and nail, to claw victory from the jaws of defeat even when everything seemed lost. "All right," Moxley said finally, looking up from the console with a mixture of triumph and trepidation. "We're good to go. Let's show them what we're made of." Harkin took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over him like a worn cloak. "Let's do it," he said, signaling Moxley to initiate the broadcast. The delegates held their breath, a collective pause that felt like the calm before a storm. The station trembled, the air thick with anticipation and fear. As the signal went out, Harkin closed his eyes, his mind filled with the cacophony of human myth and legend. Stories of gods and monsters, of triumphs and tragedies, woven together in a tapestry that defied logic and reason. The feedback was immediate, a ripple through the alien network that sent shockwaves of confusion and chaos. Harkin felt a surge of hope as the station, just for a moment, seemed to settle, an easing of the tension that had threatened to tear them apart. "It's working," Moxley said, his voice tinged with disbelief and wonder. "The aliens, they're pulling back." Laughter erupted, a cathartic release of tension and fear that swept through the room like wildfire. Delegates embraced, exchanging relieved grins and incredulous laughter. The weight of impending doom lifted, if only for the moment. "We did it," Zadra said, her voice filled with the kind of exhausted joy that only comes from surviving certain death. "We actually did it." Harkin allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, the kind that comes from realizing you've cheated fate once again. "Never doubt the power of a good story," he said, leaning back against the wall and feeling, for the first time in what felt like forever, a glimmer of peace. The station wasn't out of danger yet, far from it, but they'd bought themselves time, a precious commodity in the face of annihilation. And as long as they had time, they had a chance. "Let's not get too comfortable," Harkin reminded them, though his words lacked their usual bite. "We've still got a station to keep from falling apart." Zynrel, ever the enigmatic observer, gave a slow nod of approval. "You have my respect, humans. You are remarkable." "Yeah, Zadra said, waving a dismissive hand. "Save the heartfelt speeches for later. We've got work to do." The delegates, buoyed by their unexpected success, returned to their tasks with renewed vigor. The station might have been held together with duct tape and hope, but it was their duct tape and their hope, and that made all the difference. As Harkin set to work alongside them, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of optimism creeping in. It wasn't much, just a glimmer, but it was enough to keep him going. Because in the end, that was what humans did best. They fought, they survived, and they told stories that changed the world. And sometimes, if they were lucky, those stories were enough to save them. The delegates stood in a huddle, like survivors of a particularly nasty storm, clinging to the fragile hope that their plan would work. Harkin, looking at the console as if it might spontaneously combust, couldn't help but feel a twinge of pride. They'd managed to cobble together a plan that was as insane as it was brilliant. If they pulled this off, it would be the kind of story that would get told in dingy spaceport bars for years to come, right after the one about the three-headed alien and the malfunctioning teleport. "All right," Harkin said, clasping his hands together like a preacher whose flock was about to do something truly stupid. "Let's make sure these aliens remember why humans are the galaxy's favorite headache." Zadra, never one to miss an opportunity for sarcasm, chimed in. "Here's hoping they're as allergic to BS as we are to their dietary choices." She shot a look at the remains of an alien buffet, an array of colors and textures that looked more like a biological experiment gone wrong than something edible. Moxley was tapping furiously at his wrist console, his face a mask of concentration with a touch of "why me" sprinkled on top. "Power grids holding, but for how long? Who knows? It's a bit like watching a toddler juggle grenades over here." "Then let's not wait around for the fireworks," Harkin replied, nodding to Moxley to cue the broadcast. "Time to make our myths work for us." Zynrel observed the proceedings with a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been respect, or at least as close as his species could manage. "This mythology tactic, it is unique." "Is this typical of human problem-solving?" "It's called winging it," Harkin said with a smirk. "We're experts." The station itself seemed to agree, groaning ominously as if to underline the point. The lights flickered, a reminder that the world was teetering on the edge, held together by duct tape and sheer bloody-mindedness. But that was just another day on Elysium Station. "Broadcasts ready," Moxley announced, his voice tinged with the weariness of a man who'd had just about enough of near-death experiences for one lifetime. We're beaming our bedtime stories out into the cosmos. Let's see how they like a taste of human creativity." Harkin took a deep breath and nodded. "Send it." As the signal shot out into the void, Harkin imagined the alien fleet, sitting out there in the cold, dark silence of space, suddenly bombarded by a cacophony of human myth and legend. It was an assault of imagination, a barrage of stories that defied logic and reason, much like the current state of the station itself. "Think they'll fall for it?" Zadra asked, her voice a mix of skepticism and a touch of hope. "They just might," Harkin replied, watching as the first ripples of confusion spread through the alien network, like a stone dropped into a pond of paranoia. "We're banking on them having a healthy dose of caution when it comes to the unknown." For a moment, nothing seemed to happen, just the usual hum of the station, the distant clattering of things that probably shouldn't be clattering, and the low murmur of delegates holding their collective breath. Then, like a tide finally giving way to the moon's pull, the reports began to come in. "The aliens, they're hesitating," Moxley said, disbelief coloring his voice. "They're actually backing off." A cheer went up, a ragged sound that echoed through the crumbling halls of Elysium Station. It was the sound of relief, of a gamble paying off in a way that no sane person would have predicted. For a brief, shining moment, it felt like they had won. "Looks like our little fairy tales did the trick," Zadra said, unable to keep the grin off her face. "Score 1 for human ingenuity." Zynril inclined his head, a gesture of respect that seemed vaguely dignified in a galaxy where dignity was often in short supply. "Your stories wield power. I can see why they inspire fear." "And laughter," Harkin added, "which is why we'll be telling this one at every watering hole from here to the outer rim." The station creaked, as if reminding them not to get too comfortable. The reality was they still had a massive, failing heap of metal to contend with, but for now, it seemed almost manageable. Moxley, fiddling with his console, grimaced. "We might have scared them off, but the power grid's still a mess. We're not out of the woods yet." "Never a dull moment," Harkin said, feeling the weight of responsibility settle back on his shoulders. "But we've bought ourselves some time, and that's more than we had 5 minutes ago. Time to patch the ship with more of that legendary duct tape," Zadra suggested, already moving towards the nearest panel as if she could fix it through sheer force of will. "You read my mind," Harkin replied. "Let's see if we can hold this place together long enough to figure out a more permanent solution." As the delegates dispersed, returning to their various makeshift stations with a renewed sense of energy, Harkin couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, just a whisper, but it was enough to keep him going. "Remind me," Zynril said, falling into step beside Harkin, "to never underestimate human tenacity." Harkin chuckled. "Or our capacity for making things up as we go along." The station continued to groan and shudder around them, but for now, it was still in one piece. And as long as it stayed that way, they had a fighting chance. "How are we doing on the escape pods?" Harkin asked, as they weaved through the chaotic hallways, dodging loose panels and the occasional shower of sparks. "Functional," Moxley replied, "but if we don't stabilize the core soon, they might be our only ticket off this rust bucket." "Great," Harkin muttered. "Just what I always wanted, a high-stakes game of space roulette." As they continued their makeshift repairs, Harkin couldn't shake the feeling that they were living on borrowed time. But that was the thing about humans. They had a knack for squeezing every last drop out of the moments they were given. "Keep an eye on that console," Harkin instructed Moxley. "If anything goes haywire, I want to know about it yesterday." "No pressure," Moxley quipped, but there was a seriousness to his eyes that belied the humor. "I'll babysit this thing like it's the galaxy's last hope." In the background, the station's systems hummed and clicked, a symphony of barely controlled chaos. It was a mess, but it was their mess, and Harkin found a strange sort of comfort in that. As they worked, the occasional rumble shook the station, each one a reminder of their precarious situation. But they pressed on, patching and jury-rigging, turning adversity into opportunity with the kind of reckless abandon that would have made their ancestors proud. "Moxley, any updates?" Harkin called, adjusting a panel that had decided it was more comfortable on the floor than attached to the wall. "Stable for now," Moxley replied, eyes glued to the console. "But it's a bit like balancing on a knife edge, one wrong move and we're toast." "Let's make sure we don't give it a reason to tip then," Harkin said, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "We've come too far to go down now." Somewhere in the distance, something clattered to the floor, a sound that would have been worrying if it weren't so familiar by now. It was a reminder of the fragility of their situation, but also a testament to their stubborn resilience. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity as they worked to stabilize the station. But they pressed on, driven by a determination that was as fierce as it was foolhardy. "Almost there," Moxley reported, his fingers flying over the controls with a speed born of necessity. "If we can hold it together for just a little longer, that's the spirit," Harkin said, feeling a spark of hope flicker to life. "Keep at it, everyone. We're not done yet." Zynrel, standing nearby with an expression of something akin to admiration, spoke up. "You humans are a curious species. Each setback only seems to strengthen your resolve." "It's a survival mechanism," Zadra replied, her voice ringing with confidence. "Adapt or die, and we're big fans of the first option." The air was tense, charged with the energy of a team that was simultaneously exhausted and energized. They were on the cusp of something, and while the outcome was uncertain, the effort was undeniable. "All right," Moxley said, looking up from his console with a nod. "I think we're good. For now, at least." A collective sigh of relief passed through the group, a moment of quiet triumph in the midst of chaos. They'd managed to hold it together against all odds, and that was something worth celebrating. "Never thought I'd say this," Harkin began, a weary grin on his face, "but I think we're starting to get the hang of this." "Famous last words," Zadra shot back, but there was a warmth to her tone that softened the sarcasm. As they surveyed their handiwork, Harkin felt a sense of accomplishment settle over him. They'd faced down the impossible and lived to tell the tale, a tale that would no doubt grow in the retelling, but that was the beauty of stories. "In the end," Zynrel mused, "perhaps that is your greatest gift, your stories." Harkin nodded, feeling a sense of camaraderie with these people who had become more than just colleagues in the chaos. They were allies, comrades in arms, and together they'd done the impossible. "Stories save us," Harkin said, his voice filled with conviction. "In more ways than one." And with that they turned back to the task at hand, knowing that whatever came next they would face it together. Because that was what humans did best. They fought, they adapted, and they told stories that could change the world. And sometimes, if they were very lucky, those stories were enough to save them. The Elysium station hummed its usual discordant symphony, which was a nice way of saying everything sounded one fuse away from a spectacular fireworks display. But for now, the station had decided not to explode, which was about as good as things ever got in deep space. Harkin Vire leaned against a bulkhead that might or might not be load-bearing. By now, he'd learned not to ask questions he didn't want the answers to. It had been a long 2 days, but they'd bought themselves some breathing room, and that was worth a celebratory swig of something strong and likely flammable. "Remind me why we didn't just let this place burn," Harkin muttered to Zadra, who was busy trying to fix a console with, of all things, a plastic spoon. "Because we're unrepentant masochists," Zadra said, casting a sidelong glance at him. "And because someone's gotta keep our delightful guests from turning each other into space debris." "Right," Harkin said, rubbing his temples. "Peace conference. Alien paranoia." The galaxy's worst family reunion, Zynrel, who had remained largely quiet since the last debacle, observed the dynamic with his usual curiosity. "Your resilience continues to impress. Is this normal behavior among your kind normal?" "No." "Common? Hell no. But where's the fun in normal?" Harkin replied, flashing a wry smile. "We like to keep things interesting." Moxley approached, his face lined with the sort of weariness that came from too many hours without sleep and too many close calls with death. Power grid stable. About as stable as a toddler on a sugar high, but hey, we'll take what we can get. Good work, Harkin said, clapping Moxley on the shoulder. You've saved us from having to do a spacewalk without a suit. Moxley chuckled dryly. Wouldn't want that. I hear it's hard to breathe out there. The air was charged with the kind of energy that only came after narrowly avoiding disaster. Harkin surveyed the ragtag group of delegates, each one looking a little more worn around the edges than when they'd arrived. But there was something else in their eyes now, a glimmer of respect perhaps, or at least a grudging acknowledgement that the humans had pulled off something miraculous. Gorth, who had returned from his philosophical debate with the emergency pipe, joined them. So, what now? Do we just wait for someone else to try and kill us? Something like that, Harkin said. But first we drink. He produced a bottle of some dubious liquid, space station moonshine, a concoction that could probably also be used as engine coolant. He poured a generous amount into whatever containers he could find, cups, beakers, the occasional spare helmet. To improbable victories and duct tape, Harkin toasted, raising his makeshift glass. To duct tape, Zadra echoed, clinking her helmet against his. The greatest invention since sliced bread. Your bread comes sliced. Zynral asked, genuinely intrigued. Let's just say humans are great at making life less complicated, Zadra said, taking a swig and grimacing. Or more complicated, depending on how you look at it. The gathered delegates shared in the makeshift celebration, their laughter and conversation a welcome reprieve from the tension of the past days. They were diplomats and politicians, yes, but they were also just people who'd come dangerously close to becoming space dust. There's something to be said for the power of belief, Harkin mused, leaning back and looking at the flickering lights above. Sometimes, a good story is all it takes to turn the tide. Zynral nodded, a thoughtful expression on his alien features. You wield stories like weapons. It's impressive. Well, when the blasters don't work, you improvise, Harkin said with a shrug. That's humanity in a nutshell, not a very big nutshell, Zadra pointed out. But we make do. The station, for all its flaws, felt almost cozy in that moment. It was a mess, sure, but it was their mess, and they'd held it together against overwhelming odds. Harkin allowed himself a moment of pride in their collective achievement. It wasn't much, but it was honest work. Well, as honest as you could get in intergalactic diplomacy. Think they'll remember this? Gorth asked, looking around at the assembled delegates. Oh, they'll remember, Harkin said with a chuckle, mostly because they'll have to explain it to their superiors. Sorry, boss, we got outsmarted by some bedtime stories, Zadra grinned, and the duct tape. Don't forget the duct tape. Never forget the duct tape, Harkin agreed. It's holding this whole operation together. As the laughter faded into the familiar hum of the station, Harkin found himself reflecting on the events that had brought them here. It was a strange feeling, this sense of camaraderie with beings from worlds he couldn't even begin to imagine. They'd come here as strangers, adversaries even, but they'd leave with an understanding that transcended the petty squabbles of interstellar politics. Maybe this is what peace feels like, Moxley said quietly, his eyes distant as he contemplated the stars outside. Or maybe it's just the calm before the next storm, Harkin replied, ever the cynic. But I'll take it, the station shuddered again, a gentle reminder that it was still very much alive, if not exactly well. But for now, it was enough. They'd weathered the storm, and while the future was uncertain, they faced it with the knowledge that they weren't alone. The delegates began to disperse, each returning to their quarters or assigned corners of the station. They'd rest, regroup, and prepare for whatever came next. That was the way of things out here on the edge of nowhere. Harkin lingered a moment longer, watching as Zynral paused at the viewport, gazing out at the vast expanse of space. What do you see? Harkin asked, curious. Potential, Zynral replied, his voice almost reverent. And a great many stories yet to be told. Yeah, Harkin said, joining him at the viewport. Here's hoping they're good ones. good or bad, they'll be yours, Zynral said with a nod. With that, they turned away from the stars, leaving the future to unfold at its own pace. For now, they had each other, and that was a pretty decent start. As Harkin made his way back to his quarters, he couldn't help but think of the stories they'd spun, the myths that had saved their skins. It was a reminder that in a universe full of chaos and uncertainty, sometimes the only thing you could count on was the power of a good story. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling the familiar grit and grime that had become as much a part of him as his own skin. The station had a way of getting under your fingernails, in more ways than one. "Harkin," Zadra called from down the corridor, her voice echoing against the metal walls. "You coming?" "Yeah," he replied, turning to follow her. "Let's go see what else the universe has got for us." Together, they walked the corridors of their creaky, barely held-together sanctuary, ready to face whatever came next. Because that was the thing about humans. They thrived in the chaos, found strength in the struggle, and always had a story to tell. And as long as they had that, they'd never truly be lost. The Elysium station might have been a disaster zone, but it was their disaster zone, and for now, that was enough. Because in the end, they didn't need perfection. They just needed each other, a good story, and an endless supply of duct tape. And with that, they carried on, ready to take on the galaxy one improbable, impossible story at a time. Space was big, dangerous, and full of things that wanted to eat you, blow you up, or turn you into a cautionary tale. But as long as humans were around, it would never be boring. And that, Harkin thought with a smile, was the greatest story of all.